Hello. In this little lecture, we're going to talk about the first three sections of Chapter 23 about tradition and change in East Asia. And I'm going to point out, as I often do, that the title of the chapter, along with the subheadings, convey an important message. And this one is, as it says, about tradition and change in East Asia. If you'll remember in Chapter 20, the chapter emphasized the transformation, the many changes that occurred in European society from the 1500s to 1700s, and how that made Europe a very dynamic and growing part of the world and set the stage for it to later dominate many other parts of the globe. In chapter 23, we're going to see there is change, transformation in Asia, but there's also a very strong element of tradition. And in fact, it's going to emphasize how both the Chinese government and Japanese governments often emphasize tradition, the old ways of doing things, as a way to preserve order and stability. So think about how this is going to be different from what was taking place in Europe, this strong emphasis on tradition and the importance of preserving the old ways for social stability. Um, the chapter begins, of course, with a human interest story again. This one is about a Christian missionary called Matteo Ricci, who went to China to try and make converts there. And his story is yet another example of the connections, the interconnections that developed between Europe and Asia, Europe and Africa, Europe and the broader world that we've talked about repeatedly, the growing linkages between different parts of the world and different cultures. Um, Matteo Ricci is a key term, and he shows up here in the introduction, the human interest story, and also later on in the chapter. Uh, it points out that he tried to impress the Chinese with European science and technology as a way of trying to attract them to the Christian religion. Um, and they were, interested in the technology, but not enough to really adopt it large scale, and certainly not enough to be won over to Christianity. So his efforts to make converts among the Chinese really did not have much success. But he and other missionaries, he and European merchants, their reports back to Europe about what they saw in China uh, really had a big impact on European thought and culture, and many Europeans were very impressed with what they learned or knew about China. Uh, so again, keep that in mind of the growing awareness of different parts of the world about how others lived. Um, of course, after the human interest story, it gives you the introduction, uh, laying out a few of the main points in the chapter, and uh, on page 431, uh, beginning with the paragraph that says, by linking the world's religions and peoples. There's where the introduction starts, and it emphasizes how China and Asia in general were brought into this global network and connections by the Europeans. But the impact on Asia was much different than in the Americas or Africa. In the Americas, of course, the contacts led to basically the destruction of the native peoples and their civilizations. In Africa, it led to the growth of the slave trade, the disruption of many traditional societies, uh, and undermining old ways of life. In Asia, it's very different. That the Asian societies were large, powerful, uh, societies, um, and the European impact on them was, in many cases, minimal. Uh, the economic impact actually was beneficial to the Asians in many cases, because Asians had many goods that the Europeans wanted, and the Europeans were prepared to pay a high price for these goods like silks and spices and tea and porcelain. So economically, China and Asia in general tended to benefit from the increased economic links created by European merchants in the 1700s. And politically, um, China, Japan as well, was not particularly threatened by European um, military power at this time. They were too big, too powerful for the Europeans to have much impact on. So, especially China was very much in control of its own destiny at this time, and was able to keep the Europeans pretty much at arm's length. And actually, they dominated the relationship rather than vice versa. Japan, again, not quite as big and powerful as uh, China, but it too was able to keep Europeans out, or at least control the nature of the relationship. And as the last part of the introduction makes clear, that uh, both Japan and China were ruled by dynasties that emphasized tradition, order, stability, and that's one reason that they kept a close eye on Europeans and tried to limit their influence. It's because they saw Europeans as a potential threat to the established traditional order. Now, this emphasis on stability and tradition, you can see it again in the heading of the first section that deals with China, Chinese politics. It's called The Quest for Political Stability. That pretty much tells you everything you need to know, that for the Chinese governments from the 1300s to the 17 and even 1800s, the primary concern was political stability, political order. This is true for both the Ming dynasty and the Qing dynasty in China. So there's two dynasties that together rule for nearly 600 years. And what they have in common is this emphasis on tradition and stability. Uh, the first one is the Ming Dynasty that came into power around the mid 1300s after driving out the Mongols, who had ruled China for about 100 to 150 years. Um, the Ming Dynasty is created by a man named Hong Wu. He's the founder of the dynasty, and after driving out the Mongols, he and his followers create or recreate a very tight-knit, centralized type of system of government, uh, similar to what had existed in China before the Mongol conquest. Um, the his successors in the Ming Dynasty kept this centralized system and used it to control China, to direct policy. So again, strong, centralized governmental system with the emperor as an all-powerful ruler, supported by an extensive bureaucracy to help carry out his orders. And this is discussed a little bit later in this section as well. It briefly mentions another Ming ruler called Yang Li, who you know was important in stabilizing the Ming dynasty. I think he's like the third ruler. It's not important to know exact dates or anything, but Yang Li was one of the earlier Ming rulers or emperors, and he's a little bit unusual in the sense of he sponsored some naval expeditions that projected Chinese influence and power out into the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Uh, China had never really been much of a naval power, and after Yongle, it kind of went back to that sort of focus on land power. But Yongli's naval expeditions are an example of how the Ming Dynasty was trying to, uh, I guess you call it, promote this image of China as a restored, a revived power now that the Mongols were gone. It was kind of like a show of force to impress people that China was now back on top after driving out the Mongols. Of course, after driving out the Mongols, they wanted to make sure that the Mongols or people like them never came back. And that's one reason it talks about the Great Wall. That's a subheading here. Uh, Everyone's familiar with the Great Wall of China. There's pictures of it everywhere, including in the book. And the Great Wall that exists today, that's the one that was built by the Ming. There had been earlier versions, but the one that we see today is the one constructed by the Ming to, again, kind of make sure these nomadic Mongol types never came back. And again, it's exactly what it says, a huge wall, a great wall that, ran for, I think, close to 1,500 miles. And it's, 40, 50 feet tall, 10 to 15 feet wide, a massive undertaking. And it's an example of what China could and did do back then. That everything was bigger in China. China was the largest, most populous, most wealthiest of any of the civilizations in the world at that time, and the Great Wall reflects that. It's also reflected in what was called the Forbidden City, the imperial palace complex that the Ming build in their new capital in Beijing. And Beijing is still the capital of China today. But Beijing was made the capital by the Ming in part because it was close to the Great Wall where they could keep an eye on the Mongols or other people and make sure they never came back in. The Ming was extremely powerful for well over 100, 150 years, but as, of course, the subheadings indicate, it did decline and then eventually fall. There's a section called Ming Decline and another one called Ming Collapse. The reasons for the decline and collapse are basically internal, that over time emperors grew lazy, corrupt, and the people under them, the administrators, the officials, government, bureaucrats, tended to follow, becoming very corrupt and not doing their job in terms of promoting economic development, looking after the welfare of their people, and sort of the quality of government simply declined slowly but surely over the last 100 years or so of the dynasty, until at one point the government proved incapable of dealing with some serious famines that occurred. And just like today, when something really bad happens, we tend to blame the government for it, or blame them if they don't do something to fix it. So millions of Chinese people turned against the Ming Dynasty. They rebelled at what they saw as the inefficiency, the corruption, and that led to sort of like civil war in the country. And during the course of that civil war, people from the outside, people known as Manchus, were able to invade, break through the Great Wall, since no one was really guarding it anymore. Um, and the Manchus were able to come in and take over. The book points out that the Manchus created the Qing dynasty. This is on page 434 where it starts talking about the Qing dynasty. Manchus are not ethnically Chinese. They are people from beyond the Great Wall, from outside of China proper. Um, they had lived next door to China for a long time and had picked up a lot of Chinese customs and habits, lifestyles. Um, so they were halfway Chinese in terms of their customs, lifestyle. Um, but the Chinese always saw them as outsiders, as foreigners. And this was going to be a serious problem for the Manchus. Of how could they, and again, there's only a few million of the Manchus, how could they control and govern all of China with more than 100 million, 200 million people? The short answer is the only way they could do it was if they got a lot of Chinese people to uh, uh, support them to be loyal voluntarily. And this is one reason why the Manchus, even though they were foreigners, portrayed themselves as defenders and protectors of the traditional Chinese order. Uh, and again, this plays into the whole theme of tradition being the guiding principle of the Chinese dynasties, both the Ming, who were Chinese, and the Manchus, these foreigners who came in to rule China. Um, Many Chinese came to at least accept the Manchus as as legitimate rulers because they did put an end to the civil wars. They did restore peace and stability, restore good government. And this was especially true under the leadership of two Manchu rulers who are discussed on page 435. Kangxi, who is on our list of key terms, and then his grandson, I believe is pronounced Qianlong. Uh, these two men, together they ruled for over 100 years combined, um, were both very dedicated, hardworking rulers, uh, extremely well educated, and firm believers in the Confucius teachings about the duty and obligation of rulers to provide moral and just leadership. So they ruled in what is sometimes called an enlightened manner. They ruled in ways that promoted the welfare of China as a whole. Um, and that went a long way to winning the support of average Chinese people. That these were good rulers who looked after the ordinary person as much as any ruler can. Uh, uh, Kangxi is on the list of key terms, often regarded as sort of a model emperor, enlightened, intelligent, fair. At the same time, he was also, the book points out, topic says, a conqueror. He helped expand China, conquering new territories, bringing new areas under Chinese influence. So he did it all, and he did it well. Something that earned him the respect not only of the Manchus but of the Chinese as a whole. But it's need to remember or note that even though the Manchus tried to rule and behave in a way that was in conformity with Chinese tradition and customs, they made a deliberate effort not to uh, uh, get swallowed up by China. They took a number of measures to preserve their own ethnic identity uh, as a sort of separate ruling elite. Because again, if they mingled too much or became too Chinese, again, they would lose their identity and possibly their claim to, undisputed political power. Now, the Ming emperors, the Qing emperors, again, they, in theory, were absolute rulers who had literally no check on their power. Uh, the book points out that they were among the many nicknames or titles they had. One was the Son of Heaven, that this is the idea that heaven, divine providence, had given them the right to rule, and that this right gave them complete power, complete authority. It's a little bit like the idea of divine right of kings that was used by absolute rulers in Europe. But hopefully everyone remembers Louis XIV. Even on his best day, Louis XIV was nowhere near as powerful as Hongwu, Yongli, Kangxi, Qianlong. That uh, that that term absolutism in Europe. I mean, that was sort of a goal that they wanted to reach in China. It was reality. Um, of course, even though he had absolute power, the emperor could not run China, the government, all by himself. And it points out that to help govern, the emperors relied on officials drawn from what they called the ranks of the scholar bureaucrats. Of course, a bureaucrat was a government official. But to become a government official, especially a high government official, you had to be a scholar. You had to be educated uh, and sort of earn your position by passing a series of very difficult exams to make sure that you were qualified for the job and that you would conduct yourself in accordance with the teachings or principles of Confucianism. So there's this examination system that is used to pick the scholar bureaucrats for government service. And it wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but in general, it did provide China with probably the most talented, the best educated, and often the most honest government officials anywhere in the world at that time. Again, with the exceptions of when emperors became lazy and corrupt, bureaucrats tended to follow suit. Right? Why should you be honest if the emperor isn't? So, being the Son of Heaven carried a lot of authority, a lot of power, and it made a difference of what type of person was in that position. Because again, if someone like Kangxi, when he was in power, he made sure everyone underneath him behaved according to these high principles. Another emperor who might not care at all often let the government officials, pursue their own interests, and that was when you got into trouble. Something to think about today. We often see examples of our own government officials sometimes not behaving or following the type of standards we would like. The exam system in China was their way of trying to make sure that didn't happen. After talking about politics, the book turns its attention to economic and social changes in China in the 15 to 1700s. And notice the subheading here is about changes. In terms of politics, it's mainly about tradition, maintaining tradition, emphasizing the the traditional centralized system of government, uh, following these very old established traditions of Confucian political thinking. In economic and social affairs, there's more change than tradition. I mean, there is some tradition, of course, uh, like, for example, the patriarchal family, the patriarchal social structure. Patriarchy, of course, refers to the dominance of men in society, in the family, in politics, in all areas of life. So China was a patriarchal society, had been for a long time, just like most uh, societies at that time were patriarchal. Um, but the Chinese system was particularly uh, or more patriarchal than many. Uh, there is the term filial piety that is a key term. It's one of the subheadings here in this section. Filial piety is a Confucian concept that refers to the duty, the obligation of children to respect their parents or respect elders in general. In fact, actually, to respect anyone in a position of authority. Um, and technically, it applied to the family unit, but it had broader implications and was often interpreted in a way that everyone in society had a duty to obey people placed above them in positions of authority. Um, for example, the emperor. The emperor is like the father of the country, right? So everyone needs to obey him, obey the people he appoints to govern, to lead, and so forth on down the line. This very hierarchical society with everybody has a place, and you need to obey and respect the people in positions above you. Of course, there's a flip side to that the book doesn't mention much, but it's the idea that anyone in a position of authority has an obligation to look after the people below them, like parents, right? Children are supposed to respect their parents, but conversely, parents are supposed to look after and protect the children, right? Make sure that they're safe, they're protected, they're fed. So um, this hierarchical system that's involved or reflected in the concept of filial piety um, carries this sense of mutual obligations that people in power just can't do what they want. They have to uh, use that authority and power in a just and fair manner for the benefit of those below them. It also talks about gender relations, and that's where it really gets into patriarchy. That women had a place in society, but it was clearly below men. That they were regarded as inferior, and that they were supposed to obey and follow the wishes, the directions of men, their fathers, their husbands, brothers, uncles, whatever. Um, and that was very much a Confucian idea. And the book points out that this notion of male predominance, male supremacy, and female subordination became even stronger during this Ming and Qing time period. And it's reflected in the practice of foot binding, which is a key term. Foot binding was, of course, exactly what it said. The feet of young girls were bound very tightly, so as they grew, well, the foot would also grow, but it would sort of be deformed and would be kept at a sort of artificially small size. Um, and that this was done for a variety of reasons, but first and foremost, it's really basically a status symbol. Women with bound feet, small feet, simply could not really be self-supporting. They were incapable of moving around normally. having, you know, any type of occupation outside the home. So it sort of meant that they had to be taken care of. And bound feet were a sign that the father, the husband, was wealthy enough, powerful enough that his women, his wife, his daughters, sisters, did not have to work. So it's really primarily a status symbol among the upper classes for their wives and daughters to have bound feet. Um, but of course, that it might sound like, okay, they're being taken care of by the men, but of course it really meant that they were not able, they had no opportunities to pursue other activities, again, because they were physically incapable now because of the bound feet. Um, After talking about patriarchy, gender relations, family structure, it goes on to talk about social changes. Again, remember, this is the traditional part, patriarchy. Uh, Population growth and economic development. Here's where it gets to the change. That it points out that population grew dramatically in China between 1500 and mid to late 1700s. Why did it grow? Well, the book talks about the American food crops, just like we talked about food crops in Africa, right? Helping the population grow there. So American food crops are introduced to China by Europeans during the trade, and the result is a huge increase in population in China, and that this growing population uh, encourages, at least at first, it encourages economic growth and development. Larger population, uh, clearly it needs more food, more resources, but it can also produce more, do more. A large labor force that can be put to work, and they also all have needs for food, clothing, shelter. So a growing population creates a growing demand for goods, a growing labor force that can produce those goods. So it's sort of a upward spiral economically in China for at least 100 and, well, if we add it all together, it's probably closer to 300 or 400 years of fairly steady economic growth and development in China under the Ming and the Qing. Um, a lot of this growth and development is also encouraged by foreign trade, which the book talks about. China produced a lot of goods that other countries wanted. They came to China to buy those goods. They paid in often just cash, silver or gold, primarily silver. If you remember the Manila galleons that we talked about in chapter 19 and also chapter 21, that this foreign trade was a stimulus to economic growth in China. So in general, economically, China boomed, um, much as Europe grew economically at the same time. But there's a difference here that the book takes note of, that in China, a lot of this economic growth occurred under fairly strict government supervision and control, right? That in the emperor, the scholar bureaucrats, they're traditional, right? And they're a little suspicious of business merchants because of the Confucian tradition, put merchants kind of far down the list. They are willing to tolerate or support some economic growth and innovation, but not much. So there's a lot of government control of the economy in China, and that actually prevents China from growing even more, developing in certain ways that might have helped China more down the road. In particular, it talks about how the government is fairly hostile toward independent merchant activity, so you never see anything like the joint stock companies in Europe that we've talked about. you really don't see much in terms of technological innovation or change uh, to make things in new ways, because in part the government is just suspicious of anything new, anything different that might rock the boat, that would upset the traditional order, the traditional social order. Um, and this is down the road going to come back and haunt China, this lack of technological development, this suspicion of innovation, especially if it comes from anywhere outside of China. Then, last but not least, at least for this lecture, there's a section about the social structure of China, gentry, commoners, soldiers, mean people. Uh, we're not going to go into any detail here because there really aren't any key terms in that section. But again, just notice that at the top you have privileged classes like the emperor, the royal family, the scholar bureaucrats, the gentry, the nobles. All right, they're clearly at the top. Then come what the Chinese called the working classes, the peasants, the farmers in the countryside, artisans. Those are the people who manufacture things by hand, like craftsmen, and merchants. Um, as I said, merchants actually are below peasants and artisans in the social scheme of things in terms of how Confucian philosophy viewed uh, the value of different occupations. So again, just keep that in mind. That merchants had relatively low social prestige or status in China at this time, um, even though that they were often growing in economic wealth. Their status, their prestige was often far below that. Although, again, there were ways you can maybe get around that by bribing people or buying a piece of land and becoming a landowner or something of that nature. And then below the merchants, there were soldiers, prostitutes, what they call the mean people. Mean as in they're not noble. They're, you know, at, you know, well, I don't know what word I'm looking for here, but they're at the very bottom of the social ladder. Okay, let's stop there for right now, and we'll have another lecture that deals with the Chinese culture at this time, focusing again on Confucianism, along with the section on Japan. So that'll be we'll do those two sections in a separate lecture. This has gone on long enough. So I'll talk to you later. Bye.